Hey everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, in our 42nd session, we slow our ambitious plans to get through Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire considerably, despite my promise, despite my schedule, despite my plan that we should cover 3 chapters tonight. We are instead going to cover one and a bit, though admittedly, the bit is going to be from last week's reading. We're going to go back to the end of chapter 13 and then push on into chapter 14, The Unforgivable Curses. Before we get started, welcome to everyone who is joining me live. Becca and Angela and Joseph and Karen and Jenna and Gildarts Winters. Everyone is here, including Nicole, Megan, and her husband Marshall. They are joining us for the first time, as is Daydreams, which is a fascinating little internet pseudonym. Daydreams, D-A-E dreams, is curious. Are you aware that D-A-E is the Sindarin root of meaning shadow in Professor Tolkien's Legendarium? Because that's a very good choice. If so, I like that a lot. I should also thank, with huge sincerity, listener Nikki, who sent me a little package in the mail today featuring this rather brilliant mug. If I can hold this up so that you guys can see it here. This, I solemnly swear that I am up to no good mug, and this rather brilliant Deathly Hallows t-shirt that I'm wearing tonight. I feel very Harry Pottery. I feel very ready to talk about the Unforgivable Curses. This is, I think, particularly for our specific interests in the world of Harry Potter, a fascinating chapter, an endlessly fascinating chapter, which is why we're basically going to devote tonight's entire session to its discussion. We're going to talk ultimately a little about S.P.E.W. We're going to talk about Hermione's desire to enact social change within the wizarding world, and we'll talk a little about some of the problems associated with that, particularly as they're laid out in the text. But we are mostly going to talk about the Unforgivable Curses themselves. We're going to talk about dark magic. We're going to talk about what it is that the wizarding world finds unforgivable. It's, yes, as Joseph says, please, S.P.E.W. Yes, I know, but just for convenience's sake, I will try and initialize that properly. Yes, good. And we're going to cry about Neville Longbottom, as Jenna says in the Crowdcast chat. You better believe we're going to have some big emotions about Neville in tonight's reading. Let's begin, though, as I say, by going back to the end of chapter 13. And looking a little at the aftermath, if I can share the slide with you, look a little at the aftermath of Professor Moody's introduction. Here we are with this slide. The ferret flew through the air, its legs and tail flailing helplessly. "Never do that again," said Moody, speaking each word as the ferret hit the stone floor and bounced upward again. "Professor Moody," said a shocked voice. Professor McGonagall was coming down the marble staircase with her arms full of books. "Hello, Professor McGonagall," said Moody, calmly bouncing the ferret still higher. What are you doing?" said Professor McGonagall, her eyes following the bouncing ferret's progress through the air. "Teaching," said Moody. "Teach? Moody, is that a student?" shrieked Professor McGonagall, the book spilling out of her arms. "Yep," said Moody. "No!" cried Professor McGonagall, running down the stairs and pulling out her wand. A moment later, there was a loud snapping noise. Draco Malfoy had reappeared, lying in a heap on the floor with his sleek blonde hair now all over his brilliantly pink face. He got to his feet, wincing. "Moody, we never use transfiguration as a punishment," said Professor McGonagall weakly. "Surely Professor Dumbledore told you that?" "He might have mentioned it, yeah," said Moody, scratching his chin unconcernedly. "But I thought a good sharp shock—" "We give detentions, Moody, or speak to the offender's head of house." "I'll do that then," said Moody, staring at Malfoy with great dislike. As Beck is calling out in the chat, McGonagall is so good here, and Karen is putting giant scare quotes around the word teaching. Though it is true, I think, from Mad-Eye Moody's perspective, that he is indeed teaching a valuable lesson, a lesson which may need to be enforced through stark and frequent repetition if he had his way. True, of course, of Moody in the here and now, and ultimately the revelation that we will get about Moody's identity, to which we alluded in last week's reading. I wanted to pull this slide just to look a little at the working of the faculty here at Hogwarts, to talk a little about the roles of professors and the degree to which they are, in fact, bound by the traditions of the school. There are rules against using transfiguration in the context of punishment, which, you know, yes, there definitely should be. Those rules should definitely exist. Thank you, Professor McGonagall, for pointing that out. But surely Professor Dumbledore told you that. Surely this is one of the things that he mentioned during your orientation here. Remember when you walked into the Great Hall about 35 minutes ago? Remember that experience that you just had? Longer than 35 minutes ago, of course, in the span of the book, but in our personal reading, it was very, very recent indeed. Apparently, Moody did, in fact, receive his orientation here at Hogwarts. Yes, Professor Dumbledore did, in fact, mention that transfiguration was not to be used in a punitive context. And yet, He is ungoverned by the rules. He is ungoverned by the same restrictions which are placed upon the other professors here at Hogwarts. Even, we might speculate, given their increasing animosity through the rest of tonight's reading, Professor Snape. It's a really interesting perspective on a brand new character, right? What do we know about Moody at this point? Well, he is physically intimidating, physically grotesque in the truest sense of the word. He is resolutely and emphatically other. He is not like the professors that we have seen before, not even like Snape, to whom we might draw the most direct physical connection, in as much as Snape is the other professor who is usually described in physically critical or physically negative terms. We're mindful, of course, of the constant reappearance of Snape's greasy, lank hair whenever we get a character description for him. But Moody is ungoverned by such things. Moody is, well, an autonomous force. And one of the things that we can look at as we discuss not so much the next two chapters, but more Moody's role in the rest of the book, is the degree to which Moody, because he exists outside of the framework, or at least in a state of tension with the framework of Hogwarts, with this civil legalistic framework that we've discussed before, the degree to which he is actually most like one Harry Potter. More on that as we move forward. Jenna says, well, we used to hang students by their toes in the dungeons. It's no fun to be a teacher anymore. Yes, fair enough. So this is our introduction to Moody and his place within the established schema, the established world in the broadest sense, I think, of Hogwarts itself. This is not, though, our last interaction with Moody. We will close out chapter 13 with a different perspective on Mad-Eye Moody. Hermione made an impatient noise and began to eat at top speed again. Don't tell me you're going back to the library this evening, said Harry, watching her. Got to, said Hermione thickly. Lots to do. But you told us, Professor Vector, it's not schoolwork, she said. Within 5 minutes, she had cleared her plate and departed. No sooner had she gone than her seat was taken by Fred Weasley. Moody, he said. How cool is he? Beyond cool, said George, sitting down opposite Fred. Super cool, said the twins' best friend, Lee Jordan, sliding into the seat beside George. We had him this afternoon, he told Harry and Ron. What was it like? Said Harry eagerly. Fred, George, and Lee exchanged looks full of meaning. Never had a lesson like it, said Fred. He knows, man, said Lee. Knows what? Said Ron, leaning forward. Knows what it's like to be out there, doing it, said George impressively. Doing what? Said Harry. Fighting the dark arts, said Fred. He's seen it all, said George. Amazing, said Lee. Ron dived into his bag for his schedule. We haven't got him till Thursday, he said in a disappointed voice. The influence of Moody is already impressive, is already notable. Certainly there is no suggestion that Professor Lupin or even Gilderoy Lockhart had the same effect on the student body of Hogwarts. It is entirely possible that no professor in the history of Hogwarts has had this kind of impression or made this kind of impression upon the student body. And what is it that distinguishes him? We get, of course, this upperclassman privilege, right? And Fred and George and Lee get to sit in a position of judgment on Mad-Eye Moody because they are senior to Harry and Ron, and by extension Hermione too, and they have taken the class. They have been closer to where Moody has been, right? They've received tutelage from this weird figure who has entered Hogwarts in such mysterious and overwhelming circumstances. They've had this experience personally, and so, of course, they are putting a certain primacy, a certain priority on the having of experience. He's done it. He knows, man, said Lee. Knows what? Said Ron, leaning forward. Knows what it's like to be out there, doing it, fighting the dark arts. He's seen it all. This is the perspective that we get on Mad-Eye Moody. He, as an Auror, has been fighting the good fight, fighting against specifically the dark arts. And we've talked at length, most notably last week, of course, about what the dark arts as a phrase refers to, and what fighting the dark arts actually means, and what defense against the dark arts signifies. More on that as we move into chapter 14. But already he has made a splash at Hogwarts, and it's no surprise, of course, that Fred and George, and to a lesser extent Lee, who is never as developed as I want him to be. I always want more from Lee, because I think the position of being Fred and George's best friend is actually a narratively significant position. I think that Lee has some stories to tell. Lee could write the tell-all autobiography about his years at Hogwarts and give the privileged insight on the machinations of Fred and George. Though, as we'll see in chapter 14, even he is being kept at arm's length from the Weasley twins. They are not letting him in on their plans to hijack the Triwizard Tournament. They're not letting him in on their scheme here. There is still a profound intimacy between Fred and George that isn't actually broached by any other character, except, interestingly and potentially, Harry. Harry already has a privileged position with Fred and George that even Lee doesn't seem to have, even though the text assures us, oh no, Lee is totally their best friend. Being exceptional gets you certain privileges, not just within the frame of the world, not just within the frame of the Wizarding World, not just within the frame of Hogwarts, but with specific reference to Fred and George Weasley. They are attracted to those who have an interesting relationship with the rules, a flexible relationship with the rules that they themselves, of course, quite emphatically lack. So with all of that said, let's move into chapter 14. Let me see here. Gildarts Winter says, Moody is doing something I don't agree with here, kind of letting these students continue to romanticize war. Yes, though kind of letting the students romanticize is an interesting way of putting that. I think a very accurate way of putting that, but it is a sin of omission rather than a sin of commission. He does not at any point deliberately romanticize the war. He doesn't seem to be at any point engaged in a propagandistic exercise to make even being an Auror, more specifically to make being Mad-Eye Moody, more romantic or more glorious or more exciting, more thrilling, more rebellious than it actually is. This celebration of his character and of his role is coming from people who lack sufficient context for that role, right? We're going to, of course, also, as we discussed earlier, you know, with Neville's actions through chapter 14 or Neville's responses through chapter 14, also get the counterpoint to this, that the world is incredibly dark and incredibly scary and can cause huge emotional turmoil and upset for some significant characters, which is parenthetically going to be a really significant part of the next book in the series. When we get to Order of the Phoenix, one of the big kind of classic, the classic problematic elements of Order of the Phoenix is the degree to which Harry has been traumatized by the events at the end of Goblet of Fire. We'll, I suppose, deal with those when we get to them, but that is something that we're looking toward, right? We've already kind of primed the pump here. PTSD in its broadest and kind of most colloquial, its most non-clinical definition, trauma and stress in the aftermath of trauma. This is very quietly one of the major themes of the Harry Potter series. The Harry Potter series is in significant part about people getting over terrible, terrible traumatic circumstances. So we're going to be looking at that too as we continue to let events unfold here in their own way, at their own pace. Let me see here as I catch up with the chat. Jenna saying, romantic isn't really a word that I would associate with Moody. Yeah, no, that's fair, but there is, you know, tendency among teen boys in particular to not romantic, perhaps glamorous. Perhaps glamorous is the word that we would use to describe the response from Fred and George and Lee to Mad-Eye Moody. And this is, of course, absolutely contagious. As we'll see at the beginning of the next chapter, Ron and Hermione even, and Harry, are infected by the same enthusiasm for Moody. They are so eager for this class that they cut short their lunch break, which is, gosh, unprecedented. Though meals at Hogwarts seem to come fast and furious in these chapters of Goblet of Fire. Let's move into our... Let me, yes. Teddy Tonks Lupin says, I always imagine a high Matthew McConaughey saying, he knows, man. Puff, puff. Yes, there is an implication of that too from Lee there. He knows, man, said Lee. Knows what, said Ron, leaning forward. Knows what it's like to be out there doing it, said George impressively. He's not restricted to the school. He's actually out there in the world. He is fighting the good fight. And we should perhaps just note here that it is interesting that Fred and George are moved by this, that they find the fighting of the good fight, if not romantic, then at least glamorous, that they find this to be thrilling. They find this to be absolutely exciting. You know, I'm interested in that. We will, of course, get a better opportunity to talk about that in the near future. Let's move into then chapter 14, the very beginning of the chapter, with this slide. The next 2 days passed without great incident, unless you counted Neville melting his 6th cauldron in potions. Professor Snape, who seemed to have attained new levels of vindictiveness over the summer, gave Neville detention, and Neville returned from it in a state of nervous collapse, having been made to disembowel a barrel full of horned toads. You know why Snape's in such a foul mood, don't you? Said Ron to Harry as they watched Hermione teaching Neville a scouring charm to remove the frog guts from under his fingernails. Yeah, said Harry. Moody. It was common knowledge that Snape really wanted the dark arts job, and he had now failed to get it for the 4th year running. Snape had disliked all of the previous dark arts teachers and shown it, but he seemed strangely wary of displaying overt animosity to Mad-Eye Moody. Indeed, whenever Harry saw the two of them together, at mealtimes or when they passed in the corridors, he had the distinct impression that Snape was avoiding Moody's eye, whether magical or normal. I reckon Snape's a bit scared of him, you know, Harry said thoughtfully. Imagine if Moody turned Snape into a horned toad, said Ron, his eyes misting over, and bounced him all around the dungeon. This, of course, a direct reference to the events of the previous chapter with the transformation of Draco Malfoy into a ferret and Ron's deliberate enkindling of his fondest memory, I suppose, the deliberate preservation of this moment of magic and wonder, this restoration of justice to the world. Hey, Ron, this is what fairy tales are for. This is what fantasy stories are for. The sense that the world can, in fact, be restored to justice, like Draco Malfoy being turned into a small animal and being bounced around the corridors and hallways of Hogwarts. What's most interesting here is the way that the narrative is priming us to view Moody. In the previous chapter, we get his introduction, and then we get the scene with Draco Malfoy, where he is shown to be a rogue element, right? He is shown to be unconstrained by his professorial role, by his academic role at Hogwarts. He is something else. He is coming into the school as an outsider, and he is not completely conforming to the ideals of Hogwarts as an academic institution. Then we get that beat right at the end where Fred and George are kind of reappraising Moody and giving us this different perspective that he is a glamorous figure who has been out in the world, who has tangled with danger without a thought, by the way, you'll note from Fred and George, of the cost that strife and conflict and constant danger levied against Mad-Eye Moody himself, not just, of course, with regard to his eye or his foot, his leg, but also to his encroaching paranoia, which we've already had discussed in the frame of the text. They're not interested in Mad-Eye Moody as a person. They're interested in Mad-Eye Moody as a representative figure for what a kind of sanctioned rebellion looks like, sanctioned adventure, sanctioned action. These are important things when you are a teenage boy, particularly when you are a teenage boy like Fred and George Weasley. Here we get another perspective, though, and as we discussed last time, I really want to follow the narrative's cue on how we are supposed to regard Mad-Eye Moody, right? How we are supposed to look at this figure, and we get two vital turning points within this chapter. Not the discussion of the curses and all of that stuff. That's actually pretty consistent with what we saw from him in the previous chapter. But the first of these two important turning points that we get is this one. It was common knowledge that Snape really wanted the dark arts job. He had failed to get it for the fourth year running. Snape had disliked all of the previous dark arts teachers and shown it. Okay, so this is our establishing principle here. This is the first blush introduction to Snape. He really wants this particular job at Hogwarts. He has been denied it again and again and again. First for, well, complicated reasons with Professor Quirrell under the shadow of Voldemort himself. Then Gilderoy Lockhart, this popinjay, this charismatic figure who came in without real academic credentials to teach this class. And then, of course, Professor Lupin, who is hated personally by Snape and also BT dubs a werewolf. So Snape has kind of taken his bruises over the issue of the professorship here, over this particular post at Hogwarts. So that is established, but then we make it more personal. But he seemed strangely wary of displaying overt animosity to Mad-Eye Moody. Indeed, whenever Harry saw the two of them together at mealtimes or when they passed in the corridors, he had the distinct impression that Snape was avoiding Moody's eye, whether magical or normal. So we get there this interesting kind of metonymic representation of Moody, that he is possessed of two eyes, one of which is otherworldly, one of which is magical, and one of which is completely normal. So we would use this metaphorically to represent his gaze. You know, if you avoid someone's eye, you are avoiding their gaze, you are avoiding their interest, you're avoiding their attention. So we're using this magically through Moody's magical eye, and normally and mundanely through normal social interaction, or in the frame of normal social interaction through the use of his regular eye. Snape, as Harry sums up here, is a bit scared of him. And obviously we, as readers of this book, even if you're just reading this passage, even if you jump in at this point with no prior knowledge of Harry Potter, you understand that this means that Moody's probably a good guy, because Professor Snape seems to have attained new levels of vindictiveness over the summer. He gives Neville detention, and Neville returns from it in a state of nervous collapse, having been forced through this horrifying ordeal of disemboweling a barrel full of horned toads. This is, wow, a stark and cruel and vindictive punishment. So even if you were just reading this page, you get the sense that anyone who is against Snape, or anyone who causes Snape to be afraid, probably on the side of light, like probably a decent guy. So we are here, again, forcibly, narratively adjusting our perspective as readers on Mad-Eye Moody. Let's move into the next slide and get into our intro to Defense Against the Dark Arts here. The chat is just buzzing tonight. I apologize if I don't keep up with everything that is being said here, though I will call out Heroes and Bards observing that Snape continues to be the actual worst. Yes, fair. If you guys have specific questions, then definitely call out those questions using the little question interface on your Crowdcast control panel there. Let's push into our Defense Against the Dark Arts class, then our intro to Dada here in the frame of the 4th book. They hurried into 3 chairs right in front of the teacher's desk, took out their copies of The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection, and waited, unusually quiet. Soon they heard Moody's distinctive clunking footsteps coming down the corridor, and he entered the room, looking as strange and frightening as ever. They could just see his clawed wooden foot protruding from underneath his robes. "You can put those away," he growled, stumping over to his desk and sitting down. "Those books, you won't need them." They returned their books to their bags, Ron looking excited. Moody took out a register, shook his long mane of grizzled grey hair out of his twisted and scarred face, and began to call out names, his normal eye moving steadily down the list, while his magical eyes swiveled around, fixing upon each student as he or she answered. "Right then," he said when the last person had declared themselves present. "I've had a letter from Professor Lupin about this class. Seems you've had a pretty thorough grounding in tackling dark creatures. You've covered boggarts and redcaps, hinkypunks, grindylows, kappas, and werewolves. Is that right?" There was a general murmur of assent. "But you're behind, very behind, on dealing with curses," said Moody. "So I'm here to bring you up to scratch on what wizards can do to each other. I've got 1 year to teach you how to deal with dark—" "Wait, aren't you staying?" Ron blurted out. Moody's magical eyes spun around to stare at Ron. Ron looked extremely apprehensive, but after a moment Moody smiled, the first time Harry had seen him do so. The effect was to make his heavily scarred face look more twisted and contorted than ever, but it was nevertheless good to know that he ever did anything as friendly as smile. Ron looked deeply relieved. "You'll be Arthur Weasley's son, eh?" Moody said. "Your father got me out of a very tight corner a few days ago. Yeah, I'm staying just the 1 year. Special favour to Dumbledore. 1 year, then back to my quiet retirement." He gave a harsh laugh and then clapped his gnarled hands together. First off, I suppose we should acknowledge that The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection, forgive me, the slip there, A Guide to Self-Protection, as it is entitled in this chapter. This is not the first time that we've heard of this book. This book is actually on the list of books which Harry is required to purchase in his first year at Hogwarts. This is The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection by Quentin Trimble. It appears on the list of texts that he's given back in the pages of Philosopher's Stone. That is a deep-cut reference here within the frame of the text, which I really appreciate, though. Is this the first time that they're using this book? We haven't had specific reference to this text previously after its appearance on that shopping list. So it's possible that they've been using this throughout. Certainly they are expected to have it with them here as they begin their 4th year Defense Against the Dark Arts instruction. But this may be the first time that they are using it. Presumably not. Presumably this is the book that they have been using as they've been moving through this particular class. So then we get, well, a really interesting pickup of the conversation we had last week about what constitutes dark magic. I've had a letter from Professor Lupin about this class. Seems you've gotten a pretty thorough grounding in tackling dark creatures. You've covered boggarts, redcaps, hinkypucks, grindylows, kappas, and werewolves. Is that right? By extension, therefore, all of those named creatures are dark creatures. Capital D, dark creatures. Meaning that they are in some way inherently evil? Is that what we're supposed to take from that definition? But that doesn't seem to be true of the boggart or the grindylows or specifically werewolves. Werewolves aren't inherently evil. They are, though, inherently dangerous. And this is the first point at which we can start to understand a little about J.K. Rowling's perspective on what the dark arts, dark magic, dark wizards in general represent at this point in the evolution of her understanding of her own magical system and her own social system as we move through the rest of the series. Dark here seems to be synonymous not with evil outright, but rather with dangerous. These things are dangerous. So Defense Against the Dark Arts is more about a self-protection. It is more about being equipped to deal with those threats which might assail you in your wizarding career. That seems to be more logically comprehensible now than it was before. But, notes Moody, you're behind, very behind on dealing with curses. So I'm here to bring you up to scratch on what wizards can do to each other. I've got 1 year to teach you how to deal with dark. And what was the next word going to be? Because if the next word is wizards, then that's fine. That fits beautifully with our understanding here, okay? I'm here to teach you about what wizards can do to each other, not the natural phenomena, not the creatures of the world which might pose a threat to your life and limb as you move through your wizarding career, but rather the actual conscious application of magic in opposition to you specifically, the things that dark wizards might do. But if he was going to say dark arts, then that's a little dangerous, because dark arts, well, if you'll forgive me, that's a little problematic. That's a little ambiguous there, because dark arts there would usually be associated with, again, the commission of evil, the casting of inherently evil spells and magics, right? But dark arts also, as a phrase, might be adjusted now, given the discussion of boggarts and grindylows and werewolves. It might be adjusted to mean dangerous magics. Here, not magic that is dangerous to you, the caster, necessarily, but magic that is dangerous to you because it is being cast by someone else. That is a possible reinterpretation of what we mean by dark arts, and it makes more sense of defense against the dark arts, though let's acknowledge this right up front. It also renders very odd some previous conversations about dark wizards and dark arts and dark magic, not least of all Draco Malfoy's opinions on Durmstrang back in the Hogwarts Express chapter of this very book. Just a couple of chapters ago, Draco Malfoy is opining that it's a good thing that Durmstrang doesn't have such an orthodox, such a reactionary, such a conservative approach to the dark arts. It's not just about defense, but they actually teach you the dark arts. Is that just about teaching dangerous magics? Or is that something darker? Clearly, by implication, at least within the frame, from the perspective of Ron and Hermione and Harry, it feels as though that means evil, but we haven't quite yet arrived at a working or at least constant definition in this regard. I'm afraid that you guys are overloading the Crowdcast chat to the degree that it is not scrolling to me now, so this is tricky. Matt says, well, we don't know what a boggart does to someone besides showing their fear. If you're afraid of snakes, will it bite you? That's true. That's true. But we do know enough to say that boggarts are not inherently evil, right? That is to say that, if nothing else, boggarts are reactionary. Boggarts are creatures. They are animalistic. They are arguably animals. They do the thing that they do through instinct. It is a function of their nature rather than an actual act in which they engage. It is very different from fighting a sapient wizard, another magic user, or really anyone, I suppose, not even necessarily magic users. It is possible, I suppose, for centaurs to be evil, or for goblins to be evil, or for house elves to be evil, but not to be innately evil, I suppose, right? There's nothing in our understanding that says that certain races are just outright evil. Is the basilisk evil back in Chamber of Secrets? Well, it is representative of evil. It is certainly wildly dangerous, but if the basilisk is an animal and is evil, then what? Fluffy is an animal and is evil, or Buckbeak is an animal and is evil, given that they also are engaged in things which we would find to be dangerous, things which we would find to be problematic within the social structure of wizarding. Yeah. All right. Let me see here. Yeah, it really is. The chat is really moving. You guys are commenting on that now. Yes. Yeah. Gildarts Winters points out that the basilisk is only associated with dark magic. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the basilisk itself is dark, though. Let me refine that. It doesn't mean that the basilisk is dark within our concept of the dark arts within the frame of Chamber of Secrets. The basilisk may well be dark within this accounting, from this perspective, with this explanation that dark, or this implication that dark actually just means incredibly dangerous. Let's continue moving onward. In fact, let's get to the first of the unforgivable curses. So, straight into it. Curses. They come in many strengths and forms. Now, according to the Ministry of Magic, I'm supposed to teach you counter curses and leave it at that. I'm not supposed to show you what illegal dark curses look like until you're in the 6th year. You're not supposed to be old enough to deal with it till then. But Professor Dumbledore's got a higher opinion of your nerves. He reckons you can cope. And I say the sooner you know what you're up against, the better. How are you supposed to defend yourself against something you've never seen? A wizard who's about to put an illegal curse on you isn't going to tell you what he's about to do. He's not going to do it nice and polite to your face. You need to be prepared. You need to be alert and watchful. You need to put that away, Miss Brown, when I'm talking. Lavender jumped and blushed. She had been showing Parvati her completed horoscope under the desk. Apparently Moody's magical eye could see through solid wood as well as out the back of his head. So, do any of you know which curses are most heavily punished by wizarding law? Several hands rose tentatively into the air, including Ron's and Hermione's. Moody pointed at Ron, though his magical eye was still fixed on Lavender. Said Ron tentatively. My dad told me about one. Is it called the Imperious Curse or something? Ah, yes, said Moody appreciatively. Your father would know that one. Give the ministry a lot of trouble at one time, the Imperious Curse. Moody got heavily to his mismatched feet, opening his desk drawer and took out a glass jar. 3 large black spiders were scuttling around inside it. Harry felt Ron recoil slightly next to him. Ron hated spiders. Moody reached into the jar, caught one of the spiders, and held it in the palm of his hand so they could all see it. Then he pointed his wand at it and muttered, Imperio. We'll talk about the actual function of the Imperious Curse in just 1 second. First of all, let's do some close textual reading, shall we? Let's pay very close attention to what is being said here. Curses, they come in many strengths and forms. There are many curses, innumerable curses, some of which are very weak. We've actually seen some examples of very weak curses previously in the Harry Potter series, and some of which are extremely strong. According to the Ministry of Magic, I am supposed to teach you counter curses and leave it at that. I'm not supposed to show you what the curses are or teach you anything about them, but I am allowed to equip you with a defense against curses, which implies a couple of really interesting things. Is it possible to learn a specific counter curse without knowing the curse that you would be defending yourself against? Well, presumably, right? Presumably that is the case. If the ministry has outlawed the teaching of curses until the 6th year, but told Moody and told the Hogwarts establishment that they can teach counter curses in the 4th year, or presumably in the 3rd year, since Moody comes in saying that they are dreadfully behind already on their response to curses, that means that you can learn the counter curses, the anti-curses, the defense against curses without knowing the curses themselves. But that is not Moody's line here. Professor Dumbledore's got a higher opinion of your nerves. He reckons you can cope, and I say the sooner you know what you're up against, the better. The sooner you know what you're up against is a wildly provocative phrase here. This is a position of really fascinating complexity here. We have, of course, already been introduced to the concept of Mad-Eye Moody's paranoia, his belief that dark wizards lurk behind every shadow, that dark wizards are everywhere, in fact. This is kind of what has turned him into a figure of ridicule after his retirement from being an Auror. And apparently he was extremely well regarded throughout his entire career. This is a relatively recent development for Mad-Eye Moody, yet it is still common knowledge. It is interesting, therefore, that Moody sees the world in these terms, that whether or not these wizards will be Aurors themselves, these young witches and wizards at Hogwarts, whether or not they will be Aurors themselves, whether or not they will work for the ministry, whether they will open, joke shops or sweet shops or be magical cobblers, there's any number of career paths open to these witches and wizards, many of whom may not even practice professionally magic. They will just be a part of this world. And yet, Moody is of the belief that they will ultimately, inevitably be engaged with some kind of fight against dark wizardry. This is inevitable, right? How are you supposed to defend yourself against something you've never seen? A wizard who's about to put an illegal curse on you isn't going to tell you what he's about to do. He's not going to do it nice and polite to your face. You need to be prepared. You need to be alert and watchful. Constant vigilance, as he will call out in just a couple of pages, the possible alternate title for tonight's session, which I decided just to render instead as Unforgivable, because the notion of unforgivable, well, okay, we'll talk about the unforgivability of the curses when we get there. But right now, so do any of you know which curses are most heavily punished by wizarding law? He doesn't say how many there are, but presumably Hermione and Ron and the other students who raised their hands have a sense that there are a few, at least. They managed to call them out really quite beautifully as we move forward. And Ron gives us the first, the Imperio curse. Imperio being a corruption of the Latin impero, this kind of this rollingized, potterized form of the Latin impero, meaning I command. This is from the same root as imperative, I suppose. This gives us the same kind of concept of command underpinning all that we see here. Interesting. Yes, Spatula McGrady says, isn't that what Dada should be despite the professor's predisposition to paranoia? Well, yes, potentially, right? If by dark arts we mean dark wizardry, if by dark arts we mean curses and evil magic, then yes. But we obviously don't mean that, because Professor Lupin, though he has focused on what might be better suited to care of magical animals, right? Well, what might be suited to Hagrid's class rather than, you know, Mad-Eye Moody's class in his third year studies of Defense Against the Dark Arts, while he has put a certain priority, a certain weight, a certain significance, and a certain focus on that side of things for obvious personal reasons, those things are still a part of the class, right? Moody doesn't say that Lupin wasted his time teaching them about stuff that isn't in the syllabus. He says that, no, you've done all of this, that's great, but you're dreadfully behind on curses. Dark arts, therefore, cannot just mean evil magic. It cannot just mean deliberately hostile magic. Dark here cannot mean simply malevolent. It can also mean dangerous in the broader sense. So yes, you would argue that since curses are, I suppose, okay, let's invert this entire argument. Curses are also a part of the syllabus. So yes, it is clear that these students are actually being trained in wizard on wizard combat, right? That they are being primed for exposure to dark wizardry and dark wizards, if nothing else, right? That is definitely a part of the Hogwarts syllabus here within the Dada class. But yeah, it's a little confusing as we move forward. Good. All right. So this is our introduction to the Imperio Curse. Let's look at the consequence of the Imperio Curse. The spider leapt from Moody's hand on a fine thread of silk and began to swing backward and forward as though on a trapeze. It stretched out its legs rigidly, then did a backflip, breaking the thread and landing on the desk, where it began to cartwheel in circles. Moody jerked his wand, and the spider rose on two of its hind legs and went into what was unmistakably a tap dance. Everyone was laughing. Everyone except Moody. "Think it's funny, do you?" he growled. "You'd like it, would you, if I did it to you?" The laughter died away almost instantly. "Total control," said Moody quietly as the spider balled itself up and began to roll over and over. "I could make it jump out of the window, drown itself, throw itself down one of your throats." Ron gave an involuntary shudder. "Years back, there were a lot of witches and wizards being controlled by the Imperious Curse," said Moody, and Harry knew he was talking about the days in which Voldemort had been all-powerful. "Some job for the Ministry, trying to sort out who was being forced to act and who was acting of their own free will. The Imperious Curse can be fought, and I'll be teaching you how. But it takes real strength of character, and not everyone's got it. Better avoid being hit with it if you can." "Constant vigilance!" he barked, and everybody jumped. Moody picked up the somersaulting spider and threw it back in the jar. So this is the heart of the Imperious Curse, Imperio, the spell there. The absolute domination of the will of another, the absolute domination of the agency of another. And this is something that we have kind of tangled with before in Harry Potter, and which has always been resolutely evil, right? The manipulation of others in this Tolkienian sense, the objectification of others, the rendering of another's humanity into a function, into a tool, setting another human being to nothing but a purpose. This is evil. This is always dark. And we know that it's evil. We know that it's dark outside of the bounds of curses, outside of the bounds of the Imperious Curse, outside of the bounds of the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, because every time we've seen it, it has been treated in the most severe and stern of ways. I suppose the first instance of this would be, the taking over of Professor Quirrell by Voldemort in the first book. The second instance would be the taking over of Ginny Weasley by the spirit of Tom Riddle through the means of his diary in the second book. And then even in a way, in the third book, we get the Dementors, right? The Dementors, and this is an interesting wrinkle in our discussion of what is dark and what is dangerous here, right? We must remember that it is Professor Lupin who teaches Harry Expecto Patronum. It is Professor Lupin who teaches Harry the Patronus charm. is that a part of defense against the dark arts? Are the Dementors themselves particularly dark? This is, of course, a one-on-one lesson that Lupin gives to Harry. This is not a part of the structured class, and in fact, Harry is not going to learn under normal circumstances Expecto Patronum during his time at Hogwarts, but learn it he does, and he learns it from the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in the course of his 3rd year. The domination of others is always evil, is more evil than it is dark, if we can draw that line, right? The use of the Imperious Curse is unforgivable. We'll talk about, you know, the exact nature of unforgivable curses in just a moment, but what differentiates the Imperious Curse from other kinds of curses is that it dominates the will of another, is that it renders another less than human, which is, of course, significant because, as we'll learn, these curses only unforgivable when used against other humans. More on that in a few slides' time here. Harry uses Expecto Patronum for his owl exam, so I think it is Dada, says Matt Miller. Yeah, no, that's interesting. That could be that could be a change. That could be a shift between here and there. But yes, no, that's a really interesting point. Good thought. Good thought. Excellent. Excellent. Kate has an interesting, this is really good. I like this as a conspiracy theory here, Kate. Kate says, I feel like having Moody as a teacher gives Dumbles an out. Dumbledore can suggest Moody teach them whatever he thinks they need to know and see how long it lasts. If Hogwarts gets called out by, say, the Ministry, Dumbles can just be like, oops, you know what Mad-Eye is like, I'll talk to him. That is maybe the best account of Dumbledore's reasoning in this book that I have ever heard. Plausible deniability is very strong. I like that a lot. I like that a very great deal, Kate. Good observation. Yeah, that's really good. As Erica says, you know, Moody gonna Moody. Yeah, no, definitely. And Joseph observes Mad-Eye, the ultimate fall guy. He wouldn't even mind, is the thing. He wouldn't even mind. As Nikki says, but then again, when did Dumbledore ever care about what the Ministry said? Well, yes, within certain bounds, right? There will be consequences against Hogwarts. There are things which Dumbledore can control as headmaster and things which Dumbledore cannot control as headmaster. And again, I'm not throwing forward. We've already seen this, right? Think about Hagrid going to Azkaban in the 2nd book under the suspicion of being involved with the Chamber of Secrets. There are things Dumbledore can control vis-a-vis the Ministry, and there are things that are outside of his control. And this seems to be perfectly insulative, right? This really does give him plausible deniability in terms of the teaching, particularly within the frame. I haven't actually pulled Sirius's letter from the end of this chapter because we'll have the opportunity to talk more about Sirius Black in next week's reading. But Sirius does say that Dumbledore at least has been reading the signs, that there is something coming here. Of course, because we're moving so slowly through this book, because we're inclined to pay very close attention to where we are in the text, and because most crucially, textually, narratively, deliberately on the part of J.K. Rowling, we have cleared that hurdle back into Hogwarts. We have made that transition back into Hogwarts, and we might, as readers, no longer be thinking of the events of the Quidditch World Cup. We might no longer be thinking of the Death Eaters and the Dark Mark suspended in the air above the encampment there at the Quidditch World Cup. That may have slipped from our minds, as it appears to have slipped from the minds of Harry and his compatriots here at Hogwarts. Dumbledore, though, still reading the signs. I like that a lot. Good. Let's take a look at what it is that Moody says here right at the end of this. And then now that we've got the workings of the Imperious Curse, though I will say, total control, said Moody quietly, as the spider balled itself up and began to roll over and over. I could make it jump out of the window, drown itself, throw itself down one of your throats. These things are not going to happen. This is not going to be... I'm amused by this because it is so reminiscent of what Frodo says to Gollum when he's wielding the Precious, when he's wielding the One Ring over Gollum in the toward the end of the Two Towers. And he says, I could make you jump from a high place. I could make you leap into fire, you know, to pick two random examples, which probably won't be significant toward the end of the Lord of the Rings. Like, just, you know, it's fine. This is not foreshadowing. We actually get a weird dearth of foreshadowing as we move forward through this chapter, which is really refreshing and expands our understanding of what it is that J.K. Rowling is doing here. We get a lot of incidental detail, which is great for world building, but which doesn't connect to that primary plot as we move through the rest of the story. This is the part that I want to pay close attention to, though. Years back, there were a lot of witches and wizards being controlled by the Imperious Curse. Harry knew he was talking about the days in which Voldemort had been all-powerful. Some job for the Ministry trying to sort out who was being forced to act and who was acting of their own free will. I can only imagine the difficulty of that. And of course, it's understandable that Ron should have heard of this curse because Arthur Weasley has worked so closely with the Ministry. And this is this would be a huge undertaking. This would be a huge endeavor, trying to differentiate between those people who have been acting under the influence of the Imperious Curse and those who have been acting under their own less complete, less understandable, certainly less excusable impulses and motivations. The Imperious Curse can be fought, and I'll be teaching you how, but it takes real strength of character, and not everyone's got it. By implication, therefore, everyone who was under the influence of the Imperious Curse during Voldemort's period of tyranny was lacking that necessary strength of character. That is something that we should pay close attention to as we move forward. Better, or at least that is what Moody is asserting. Let's not confuse Moody's voice with the narrative voice here, right? That is something that Moody is asserting to be true. It may not be true. He may be putting either a didactically important and significant weight upon self-discipline, self-control, strength of will, you know, learning your tricks and techniques here in your Defense Against the Dark Arts class for the benefit of these students, or this may be a function of his worldview now that he is a little more erratic than once he was. Better avoid being hit with it if you can. Constant vigilance, he barked, not for the last time. Yes, Heroes and Bards asks, would those who could throw off the Imperious Curse be less susceptible to leglomancy? Yes, I mean, to the strength of character, strength of will, strength of not even personality, but almost personhood, strength of identity. These are very common threads in the most powerful applications of magic that we see within the frame of Harry Potter. And again, we've already seen this. We've already seen this with the Patronus charm. This has already been brought to our attention within the frame of the narrative. We don't have to skip ahead to see that. Possibly, I would argue probably yes. Yeah, good. All right. Gosh, we're halfway through our session already. I can't believe that we're. I'm so glad that we only picked one. One chapter to do tonight. Let's talk about the second of the Unforgivable Curses. There's one, the Cruciatus Curse, said Neville in a small but distant voice. Moody was looking very intently at Neville, this time with both eyes. Your name's Longbottom, he said, his magical eyes swooping down to check the register again. Neville nodded nervously, but Moody made no further inquiries. Turning back to the class at large, he reached into the jar for the next spider and placed it upon the desktop, where it remained motionless, apparently too scared to move. The Cruciatus Curse, said Moody. Needs to be a bit bigger for you to get the idea, he said, pointing his wand at the spider. Engorgio! The spider swelled. It was now larger than a tarantula. Abandoning all pretense, Ron pushed his chair backward as far from Moody's desk as possible. Moody raised his wand again, pointed it at the spider, and muttered, Crucio! At once, the spider's legs bent in upon its body. It rolled over and began to twitch, horribly, rocking from side to side. No sound came from it, but Harry was sure that if it was given voice, it would have been screaming. Moody did not remove his wand, and the spider started to shudder and jerk more violently. Stop it! Hermione said shrilly. Harry looked around at her. She was looking not at the spider, but at Neville. And Harry, following her gaze, saw that Neville's hands were clenched upon the desk in front of him, his knuckles white, his eyes wide and horrified. Moody raised his wand. The spider's legs relaxed, but it continued to twitch. Reducio, Moody muttered, and the spider shrank back to its proper size. He put it back in the jar. Pain, said Moody softly. You don't need thumbscrews or knives to torture someone if you can perform the Cruciatus Curse. That one was very popular once, too. Yes. Raheet saying, knowing who Moody really is, the beginning part where he asks Neville's name, it makes me cringe. Yes, and Raven Darkholm calling out, Neville doesn't deserve this chapter. Neville has been through it. That is for sure. Yes, okay, let's not jump ahead in the narrative. Yes, this is specifically relevant to Neville. We will talk about that when it is revealed to us. For now, let's focus on the Cruciatus Curse. The second of the Unforgivable Curses comes from the Latin I torture or I torment. The crucio, of course, is the same root that gives us cross from crucifixion. It's obviously the same root there. It is interesting, I think, that if the first unforgivable curse involves the domination of another's will, the second involves not the domination of their will, the stark opposite of that, in fact. We cannot remove agency from someone who is under the influence of the Cruciatus Curse, because to do so would render the curse itself useless. It would render the curse meaningless. The whole point of the Cruciatus Curse is to remove not agency, not will, not presence, but power. This is debilitating. This is an actual enforced physical torment. And that is, well, I mean, clearly a stark kind of evil. This is less morally ambiguous, even, or not less morally ambiguous. I think the domination of another's free will is pretty morally clear. It is less morally obscure, perhaps, less philosophically obscure than the Imperious Curse, because clearly the causing of pain, particularly without any kind of greater effect, the Cruciatus Curse does not inflict pain up to a certain point. The consequence of the Cruciatus Curse, or the goal of the application of this curse, is dependent on the wizard who casts it. It is a tool, and in using that tool, in wielding that tool, the wizard is even more morally culpable for the consequences, I would argue. It is extremely, extremely stark. Yeah. C-Star says, C-Star's calling back to a previous discussion here that I need to scroll back and find. This is interesting. Corporeal observes, given the existence of Veritaserum, the torture has no practical value. It is purely for causing pain as an end in itself. I mean, partly there was a problem with that within the wizarding world, where we don't want to be in a mechanically reductive wizarding world. We don't want to allow ourselves to slip into an understanding of the wizarding world that reduces all magic to primary function, right? The Veritaserum exists. It causes the revealing of secrets, the telling of truths, right? That is what it is for. But it is not the only way of achieving that goal. And to set aside the Cruciatus Curse in favor of Veritaserum is, you end up very quickly with, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Everything is going to be solved by the application of this one particular tool. That is not to defend the Cruciatus Curse and defend its utility, to defend its function in the wizarding world, but it is, you're right, a tool of torment. The consequence of this torture is almost irrelevant to the function of the torture itself. That is absolutely true, yeah. Megan Moore says, does Cruciatus actually cause physical damage to the body, or does it just overload the body's pain receptors? I would hesitate to put it in such scientific terms, right? It isn't triggering a nerve response all over the body, or it may be doing that, but it is, because it is doing that magically, it may be doing other things besides. It may be able to overwhelm the body with more pain than the body can actually process, right? It may not be simply triggering a physical response. I do not think, however, that it causes lasting physical harm, except to the degree that being under immense stress and pain causes lasting physical damage. I think that is the physical consequence of the Cruciatus Curse. Yes. Good. We have an interesting, oh no, we've lost it in the ongoing march of the chat. Yes. C-Star's calling out that C-Star was noting what I said about the Cruciatus and Imperious Curses being mutually exclusive due to the feelings they cause. Yes, one is in the domination of the other, the eradication of the will and the presence, the identity of the other. The second, the Cruciatus Curse, is actually dependent upon those things still being manifest, because you still have to, well, if we assume that there is a function to the Cruciatus Curse in its specific application beyond simply the causing of pain and torment, which there may not be. It may just be a spell designed to, or not designed to, it is a spell designed to cause tremendous pain. It may be used to cause tremendous pain with no greater function or utility than that. Yes. Corporeal's asking, what do we think of the Unforgivable Curses as a concept? As in, are Imperio and Crucio that much worse than other spells which cause control or pain? Yes, but we'll get to that in just a moment, or possibly, but we'll get to that in just a moment when we actually delve into it. But first of all, we have to conclude our trilogy of terrible curses here with the killing curse. Right. Anyone know any others? Harry looked around. From the looks on everyone's faces, he guessed they were all wondering what was going to happen to the last spider. Hermione's hand shook slightly as, for the third time, she raised it into the air. Yes, said Moody, looking at her. Avada Kedavra, Hermione whispered. Several people looked uneasily around her, including Ron. Ah, said Moody, another slight smile twisting his lopsided mouth. Yes, the last and worst. Avada Kedavra, the killing curse. He put his hand into the glass jar, almost as though it knew what was coming. The third spider scuttled frantically around the bottom of the jar, trying to evade Moody's fingers, but he trapped it and placed it upon the desktop. It started to scuttle frantically across the wooden surface. Moody raised his wand, and Harry felt a sudden thrill of foreboding. "Avada Kedavra!" Moody roared. There was a flash of blinding green light and a rushing sound as though a vast invisible something was soaring through the air. Instantaneously, the spider rolled over onto its back, unmarked but unmistakably dead. Several of the students stifled cries. Ron had thrown himself backward and almost toppled off his seat as the spider skidded toward him. Moody swept the dead spider off the desk onto the floor. "Not nice," he said calmly. "Not pleasant. And there's no counter curse. There's no blocking it. Only one known person has ever survived it. And he's sitting right in front of me." Inviting Harry to go into a deep flashback onto the formative event in his early life, of course. So the killing curse, Avada Kedavra. Obviously, this is taken from the common magical word abracadabra, right? This is a variation of that abracadabra word, which actually is attested to from the 2nd century AD in a Roman book, Liber Medicinales. I suppose I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but there it is. So we find the word abracadabra in real life history from the 2nd century AD attested there. There are a few accounts of where abracadabra comes from. J.K. Rowling certainly gives us an account. She says that the original phrase, that it was taken from Aramaic, a Semitic language that became the lingua franca throughout the Middle East and the Near East, and to a certain extent the Far East, and even to a certain extent Western Europe too, in and around the 6th and 7th centuries AD. She attested that this was actually from an Aramaic phrase meaning "let that thing be destroyed," which is really interesting. And you can find reference to that account everywhere. That the Aramaic form of Avra Kedavra, I suppose, is supposed to be the Aramaic phrase, that this means "let this thing be destroyed." This is all over the place. This is also kind of erroneous. It's kind of an urban myth. J.K. Rowling is not to blame for this, because the myth had already been in existence for about a century before she used it for the purposes of Harry Potter. But there is no Aramaic root for abracadabra that we know of. There is no root form of this phrase in Aramaic from the time, right? It only appears anywhere. This accounting, this etymological explanation for the word abracadabra only appears in the 1890s, right? It appears out of nowhere. It is most likely made up. It is most likely a made up explanation for this word, which, as I say, is attested to from the 2nd century onward. There is also another possibility. Let me check mine. I did some research into abracadabra today, you guys. It's fascinating stuff. The word might be derived from the Hebrew words for Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Ab, Ben, and Ruach HaKodesh, respectively. So it may be, it may come from this Hebrew prayer, in effect, a Hebrew exclamation, I suppose, from around that time. Not quite around that time, but it's a little complicated. But yes, probably not the explanation that J.K. Rowling offers, though for once J.K. Rowling, absolutely not to blame for that. She has fallen into a common etymological myth here. Yes, good. Let me see her. Jenna's urging me to keep speaking Hebrew. I'm afraid I really can't. My knowledge of Hebrew is extremely limited, despite I would love to learn more. As a student of linguistics, Hebrew is, and the kind of Semitic root languages are absolutely fascinating, because they don't function in any way like the Romance languages function. They're completely unique, completely distinct. Yes, some fine day I will have time and leisure enough to delve into the study of Hebrew. Yes, good. Good. All right. Let me see here. Good. Oh, wow. Interesting. Spatula McGrady observing with a great deal of acuity, I think the thirst to kill another historically has no linguistic ties. True, right? We don't need a deep store of etymological knowledge in order to make this work. Let's not get distracted by abracadabra itself or its co-opting here into Avada Kedavra, the killing curse. Obviously, this is the third of the Unforgivable Curses. Obviously, this is the purest form, I suppose, of the Unforgivable Curse. We've talked about the domination of another, we've talked about the torment of another, and now we have the eradication of another. Now we have the outright destruction of that other identity. So we have, and again, I'm not talking about bodies here. Bodies are important in Harry Potter, but much less important than identities. One's identity that sense of oneself that comes from knowledge of oneself, that comes from one's community, that comes from one's, sense of one's own tribal signifiers and communal signifiers and social signifiers. Identity is extremely important in Harry Potter. Identity is important in Harry Potter because Harry Potter is a fantasy story, and identity is extremely important. Names are important. Being who you are is important. Being exceptional, being prophesied, these things are all critical in fantasy storytelling. But Harry Potter is also a story of the coming of age. Harry Potter is also an adolescent adventure story, and identity is of crucial importance to adolescents in the real world and to adolescent storytelling. Both stories intended for an adolescent audience and stories about teenagers and those people who are just developing into the full measure of themselves. And we've been talking about identity in the frame of Harry Potter since literally the first episode of Dear Mr. Potter, right? The notion of Harry as an exceptional individual, the notion of Harry as a wizard in the Muggle world, the notion of the lightning scar, which we don't mention much now, except either as a signifier of the proximity of Voldemort or the influence of Voldemort, or as a marker of identity. This is something that indicates who Harry Potter actually is. Sorting houses, his presence at Hogwarts, his friendship with Ron and Hermione, his relationship with the Dursleys, his connection with Sirius Black, his connection to a lesser extent with Remus Lupin and Albus Dumbledore too. All of these things speak to the importance of identity within the frame of Harry Potter. So, the 3 unforgivable curses: subjugate identity, challenge identity, torment identity, and then ultimately eradicate identity. That may be why these 3 curses are distinct and these 3 curses are set apart from the others. Let's take a look at a slide that I have entitled Constant Vigilance 2. Moody was speaking again from a great distance, it seemed to Harry. This is after Harry's had the flashback to the flash of green light and the death of his father, the death of his mother, right? His first confrontation with Voldemort that gave him the scar. He's now remembering those events again, and we emerge from that flashback back to the present. Moody was speaking again from a great distance, it seemed to Harry. With a massive effort, he pulled himself back to the present and listened to what Moody was saying. Avada Kedavra is a curse that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. You could all get your wands out now and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed. But that doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. Now, if there's no counter curse, why am I showing you? Because you've got to know. You've got to appreciate what the worst is. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're facing it. Constant vigilance, he roared, and the whole class jumped again. Now, those 3 curses, Avada Kedavra, Imperius, and Cruciatus, are known as the Unforgivable Curses. The use of any one of them on a fellow human being is enough to earn a life sentence in Azkaban. That's what you're up against. That's what I've got to teach you to fight. You need preparing. You need arming. But most of all, you need to practice constant, never-ceasing vigilance. Get out your quills. Copy this down. They spent the rest of the lesson taking notes on each of the unforgivable curses. No one spoke until the bell rang, but when Moody had dismissed them and they had left the classroom, a torrent of talk burst forth. Most people were discussing the curses in awed voices. Did you see it twitch? And when he killed it, just like that. They were talking about the lesson, Harry thought, as though it had been some sort of spectacular show. But he hadn't found it very entertaining. And nor, it seemed, had Hermione. The use of any one of these curses is enough to get you imprisoned in Azkaban for the rest of your life with no thought of parole, no thought of rehabilitation, no thought of returning to the society of your fellow wizards. This is a one-shot deal. This is a one strike and you are out, zero tolerance kind of policy. You use an unforgivable curse and hey, there's a reason that we call them the unforgivable curses, because you will not be forgiven. You will not be allowed back out of Azkaban. By the way, by implication, we get a couple of really interesting things in this slide actually, which are clear by implication, right? The fact that these 3 curses, these 3 unforgivable curses, get you a one-way ticket, a life sentence in Azkaban, suggests that other crimes do not get you a life sentence in Azkaban. That, as we've discussed back when we were discussing, the actual mechanics of Azkaban in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban, appropriately enough, when we were talking about how this wizard prison works, one of the open questions is, well, do people get to leave? Are people sent to Azkaban for a while and then allowed to re-enter wizarding society? By implication, yes. By implication, that must be true. Otherwise, the earn a life sentence phrase is redundant, is unnecessary. You will go to Azkaban would be sufficient in that point. It seems as though Azkaban does have some kind of policy of Well, it's probably hoping too much, in fact, that it has any kind of program of rehabilitation in Azkaban. But, it does at least allow people to leave after they have served their time. We also, crucially, and this is another topic that we've talked about throughout our entire discussion of Dear Mr. Potter, we also get another perspective on the casting of magic. It is absolutely crucial to note that Ron puts up his hand to discuss the Imperio curse, right? To suggest, to name the Imperious curse, and he does so. And then Moody casts the spell Imperio. And Neville puts his hand up and says the Cruciatus curse. And Moody says, yes, absolutely, that's the second one. And then he casts it, Crucio. When Hermione puts her hand up, she says the name of the spell. She doesn't say the name of the spell. She says the spell. She actually says the incantation. She says Avada Kedavra. She doesn't say the killing curse, Professor Moody, sir. That's fascinating. We've had this before, of course, where we can refer to spells by not their names, I suppose, but by the actual spell word itself, by the magic word which triggers the spell. But here we get something that we've never had before, which is the acknowledgement that the saying of the word is insufficient, that Avada Kedavra is a curse that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. You could all get your wands out now and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed, but that doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. Now, there are two thoughts here that are somewhat in conflict, I think. Avada Kedavra is a curse that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. Okay? It just needs raw strength. If we take magic to mean the magical potential of the individual, right? If you are particularly strong, then you have a lot of magic, right? If that's what we mean by that term, which is traditionally in the frame of Harry Potter, how that term has been used, right? Harry is particularly powerful. He's got chops. Think back to his learning of the Expecto Patronum charm, of course. You could all get your wands out now and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed. By implication, therefore, it requires a lot of magic. You could all cast it simultaneously at me, and I wouldn't even get a nosebleed. Therefore, you are not possessed of a great deal of magic. You are all magically weak because you're children, by implication, right? But that's clearly not what he means. That doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. So magic isn't about raw strength. By implication, again, I'm not here to teach you how to do it implies I could teach you how to do it. You could learn how to cast this spell, how to cast this spell more acutely, how to cast this spell more deftly, how to cast it more precisely. And magic, therefore, means both strength and skill. Our understanding of what it takes to cast a spell is now finally uniting these two disparate ideas, that it is about study. It is about this formal structure of magic that we've discussed before, right? The formalization of these magical conventions into spells. This is how wizards cast magic, or how wizards wield magic, is through the casting of spells. You have the word and the form and the flick and the wand and the whole thing working in harmony, and that's how you do it. But also, there is just this magical potential behind you. There is just strength as well. It's not unlike, I suppose, I don't know, boxing or something like that, right? Boxing's great. You need a great deal, or wrestling or MMA or any kind of martial art, I suppose. You need the strength, you need the power, but you also need the skill. These two things united give us magic, give us magical power, give us magical potential. That's something which we've kind of speculated about previously in Harry Potter, but this is by far, I think, the clearest accounting that we've had of it so far. Let me catch up with the... that's really interesting. Teddy Tonks Lupin saying you have to really mean it for the spell to work. Interesting. Especially McGrady clarifying you must understand, but you must also feel it. Yes, of course, because that magical potential too, as we discussed again back when we were learning the Patronus charm, that magical potential too seems to be reflective of one's emotional state, but also one's innate strength. It's reflective in a broader sense. And this is kind of speculation without foundation at this point in the Harry Potter series. But we might argue, because we're talking so much about identity, because we're talking so much about what it is that makes you who you are, that unification of strength and emotional state and skill, that is actually pretty close to your identity. That is who you are in that moment. So it might be fair to say, even at this point in the Harry Potter series, that magic is, your ability to cast spells is anchored in the strength and clarity and acuity of your own personal identity, of your personality, of your selfhood, in a sense. More on that too as we go. Oh, Angela's asking if we're pulling out a lot of pins tonight. Should I dance a little jig? Yeah, we really are, right? There's a lot of stuff contained within this chapter that we have been foreshadowing for, 3 1/3 books now, I suppose. This really is a major turning point. And I was actually just reading part of the promotional material for Goblet of Fire. J.K. Rowling gave an interview right before Goblet of Fire came out where she was talking about the 4th book in the series and talking about it in terms of it being a pivotal book, and this book is going to change our understanding of everything. And I was I was pushing back against that idea when we were talking about Prisoner of Azkaban, because it is my contention that actually Prisoner of Azkaban is the biggest turning point in the Harry Potter series, and I still absolutely hold to that. I think that without Prisoner of Azkaban, we just wouldn't be able to have Goblet of Fire in this form. It would be discontinuous with the first 2 books in the series. If Prisoner of Azkaban had been more in the mold of Philosopher's Stone or Chamber of Secrets, then the hard transition into Goblet would have been much more difficult to accomplish. So for me, Prisoner still works as the greatest turning point in the series. But looking at Goblet of Fire, there is a lot of specificity in the text here. Our understanding of everything is now that much more specific. It's that much more pinned down. It's that much more acute. And that is fascinating to people like me, I suppose, to people who've been reading these books very, very carefully. So that gives us the Unforgivable Curses. Why are the Unforgivable Curses unforgivable? Because they are clearly more powerful. They are clearly used only for evil. There is never a good, again, let's note this very carefully, right? There are 3 unforgivable curses. What do we mean when we're talking about the unforgivable curses? We're talking about the use of the Imperious Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, or the Killing Curse against another human being. That is what makes them unforgivable. That is what will get you this one-way ticket life sentence in Azkaban. Using these spells under other circumstances, presumably, fine. Why then are they so firmly within the bounds of defense against the dark arts? Why are we putting such importance, such primacy on these 3 specific curses if other spells can also presumably be turned to evil purpose, right? We can use Engorgio to hurt someone, presumably. We can use Reducio to hurt someone. We can probably use Lumos to hurt someone if we really, really try. I suppose the only one that we couldn't use to hurt anyone would be Expecto Patronum, right? I don't know that would have any kind of weaponizable functionality. I'll need to give that some more thought. But spells are dangerous, right? Kids have been getting hurt throughout the Harry Potter novels. Harry's ended up without bones in his arm. He's ended up with all kinds of misadventures through magic and the application of magic and otherwise. But these 3 spells, when used, these 3 curses, when used against other human beings, are unforgivable because it is my contention they target that core identity. These, to some extent, challenge, dominate, or eradicate the personhood of another individual, and that is across the line. These things can never be used for a noble purpose, can never be used even for morally dubious purpose. Any invocation of these 3 curses against another human being, again, vitally, looking at some of the problematic racial politics, which, wow, we are not going to have time to delve into. We're maybe going to have to hold the discussion of S.P.E.W. until next week. But all of that is to say that when we're targeting other wizards, these things are unforgivable because identity is so crucial in the world of Harry Potter. Let's definitely get through Neville before we wrap up tonight's discussion. Interesting. Paranel asks, could the Avada Kedavra curse be considered the humane way to butcher animals for meat in the wizarding world? Well, the use of Avada Kedavra is clearly morally defensible under certain circumstances. How do we know that it is morally defensible under certain circumstances? Because Mad-Eye Moody just did it in the classroom in front of a bunch of very impressionable teenagers. He just used the curse. So using the curse is not inherently morally questionable. Certainly, we could argue that using the curse for demonstrative purposes within the frame of the Defense Against the Dark Arts class is actually morally defensible, outright morally defensible. So yes, actually, yes, if it can be said that we've got to, again, very carefully distinguish this. Why are some spells dark? Why is some wizardry dark? Why are some curses dark? Is it because of the function to which they are put? Is it because of their intended utility? Or is it because they spring from some font that is itself irreducibly evil? Is there some dark, malevolent force in magic itself, which even using it a little bit is dangerous, is dark, is evil? Again, Mad-Eye Moody's use of the killing curse, right there, use of all three unforgivable curses right there in the classroom, suggests no, he's not tapping into dark powers here, presumably, right? He's just using things which are incredibly dangerous. Would it be morally acceptable, therefore, to use Avada Kedavra to slaughter animals in a humane way? Yeah, probably. I can't think of an objection to that we get from the text up to this point. Yes, there it is. Good. Again, we're dealing with huge questions over moral culpability here, and of course our engagement with personhood at this point in the story. Let's take a look at Neville. Neville, Hermione said gently. Neville looked around. Oh, hello, he said, his voice much higher than usual. Interesting lesson, wasn't it? I wonder what's for dinner. I'm starving, aren't you? Oh, yes, I'm fine. Neville got, I'm sorry, I failed to copy a line of dialogue there. I do apologize. Picking up from the next line of dialogue. Oh, yes, I'm fine. Neville gabbled in the same unnaturally high voice. Very interesting dinner. I mean, lesson. What's for eating? Ron gave Harry a startled look. Neville, what? But an odd clunking sound sounded behind them, and they turned to see Professor Moody limping toward them. All four of them fell silent, watching him apprehensively, but when he spoke, it was in a much lower and gentler growl than they had yet heard. It's all right, Sonny, he said to Neville. Why don't you come up to my office? Come on, we can have a cup of tea. Neville looked even more frightened at the prospect of tea with Moody. He neither moved nor spoke. Moody turned his magical eye upon Harry. You all right, are you, Potter? Yes, said Harry, almost defiantly. Moody's blue eye quivered slightly in its socket as it surveyed Harry. Then he said, You've got to know. It seems harsh, maybe, but you've got to know. No point pretending. Well, come on, Longbottom. I've got some books that might interest you. Neville looked pleadingly at Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but they didn't say anything, so Neville had no choice but to allow himself to be steered away, one of Moody's gnarled hands on his shoulder. This is the defense for the defense against the dark arts, right? This is the reason that defense against the dark arts is on the syllabus at Hogwarts. You need to know. This is important, and you have to be armed to be equipped with this knowledge. The knowledge not even necessarily of the specific applications of this magic, but the knowledge of the possibility space, your awareness. So you have your specific knowledge, your intellectual knowledge, if you like, and then also your awareness, your wisdom, if you like. Both of these things have to be in play if you're going to survive. That is Moody's assertion here anyway. Yeah. Oh boy, that's okay, yes. Corporeal calling out here. Is this convincing? Does this fit in with the character at all? Is JKR really playing fair here? Jenna, I just saw. Yes, Jenna just responded to this. This is with regard to the secret identity of Alistair Mad-Eye Moody in the course of this book. Jenna responds with exactly the response that I would give. I feel like it's him trying to gain people's trust. I absolutely feel the same way. This is utterly performative, right? But also, one of the things that we have to remember about Mad-Eye Moody's guise in the course of this novel is that he is supposed to present as Mad-Eye Moody, and the events of this book take place over the course of a year, and no one questions him. So presumably this is consistent with what he knows of Alistair Moody, what he knows of this new professor of dark arts at Hogwarts. But it is notable here. It's all right, Sonny. Why don't you come up to my office? Come on, we can have a cup of tea. Neville looks more frightened. He neither moves nor speaks. Moody turns to Harry and says, You all right, are you, Potter? Drawing that connection again with Harry personally. I wonder if he would have come up to Neville if Harry hadn't been there. But either way, yes. Oh, and Karen, that's a great pull. I think there was some complicated father-son dynamics working themselves out here. That's a very good point. Wow. That's a very good and interesting point. Yes, good. As I said, when we get to the end of this book, we'll be able to look back at Mad-Eye Moody, and we'll pull, I think, some of these significant slides. We'll pull some of these significant moments through the course of the book and then reinterpret them with our extra knowledge. Good. All right, let's move on to the aftermath of all of this, in fact. Wouldn't Moody and Dumbledore be in trouble with the Ministry if they knew we'd seen the curses? Harry asked as they approached the fat lady. Yeah, probably, said Ron. But Dumbledore's always done things his way, hasn't he? And Moody's been getting in trouble for years, I reckon. Attacks first and ask questions later. Look at his dustbins. Balderdash. The fat lady swung forward to reveal the entrance hall and they climbed into the Gryffindor common room, which was crowded and noisy. Should we get our divination stuff then? Said Harry. I suppose, Ron groaned. They went up to the dormitory to fetch their books and charts to find Neville there alone, sitting on his bed, reading. He looked a good deal calmer than at the end of Moody's lessons, though still not entirely normal. His eyes were rather red. You all right, Neville? Harry asked him. Oh, yes, said Neville. I'm fine, thanks. Just reading the book Professor Moody lent me. He held up the book, Magical Water Plants of the Mediterranean. Apparently, Professor Sprout told Professor Moody I'm really good at herbology, Neville said. There was a faint note of pride in his voice that Harry had rarely heard there before. He thought I'd like this. Telling Neville what Professor Sprout had said, Harry thought had been a very tactful way of cheering Neville up, for Neville very rarely heard he was good at anything. It was the sort of thing Professor Lupin would have done. This is, of course, enormously touching, and the restoration of Neville to an emotional equilibrium, and just the showing of kindness to Neville and the enkindling within his pigeon breast of pride, of a sense of self, of a sense of that greater identity. All of these are wonderful things, but we must pay close attention to what the narrative is doing here. I said that we were going to try to look at Mad-Eye Moody in the way that the narrative is urging us to look at Mad-Eye Moody. And this is a sucker punch. This is an absolutely compelling argument in favor of Mad-Eye Moody. We draw here the direct comparison. We've done this at the beginning of the chapter, of course, where Moody refers to the letter that he received from Professor Lupin. I'm curious about when that letter could have arrived, in fairness, but he certainly received a letter from Professor Lupin saying that, you know, the class was in safe hands and so on and so forth. Here we get something even better than that. It was a very tactful way of cheering Neville up, for Neville very rarely heard he was good at anything. It was the sort of thing Professor Lupin would have done. We don't just allow this act of kindness and act of empathy, I suppose, sympathy at the very least, but this act of connection and humanity with Neville Longbottom, the bleeding heart of the Gryffindor Tower here. We don't just allow this act to stand on its own terms. We draw the direct comparison to Remus Lupin. Mad-Eye Moody's a good dude, it turns out. He is Lupin-esque in his goodness. This is very clear from the reading here. Very intentional. Good. Yeah, oh, we're also calling out the balderdash right there at the end of Ron's dialogue. Attacks first and ask questions later. Look at his dustbins. Balderdash. Ron not commenting on Mad-Eye Moody, but rather offering the passphrase into the Gryffindor common room there. Yes, good, good. Yes, basically his uncle, right? That's a very good pull for Lupin. That's pretty much exactly the relationship. The uncle actually works really quite well in terms of Harry's personal and emotional connection with Lupin. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left and a giant subject to hit. You know what? Let's do it. Let's get into S.P.E.W. I've got 2 slides here. I want to basically do both of these slides, but we'll pull out some incidental details here in the first slide. Then we'll cover the second slide, and then I will give a very quick gloss of the arguments here, which this may actually work out for the best for all concerned. Here we are. Hermione sat down, laid the things she was carrying in an empty armchair, and pulled Ron's predictions toward her. Not going to have a very good month, are you? She said sardonically as Crookshanks curled up in her lap. Ah, well, at least I'm forewarned, Ron yawned. You seem to be drowning twice, said Hermione. Oh, am I? Said Ron, peering down at his predictions. I'd better change one of them to getting trampled by a rampaging hippogriff. Don't you think it's a bit obvious you made these up? Said Hermione. How dare you? Said Ron in mock outrage. We've been working like house elves here. Hermione raised her eyebrows. It's just an expression, said Ron hastily. Harry laid down his quill too, having just finished predicting his own death by decapitation. What's in the box? He asked, pointing at it. Funny you should ask, said Hermione with a nasty look at Ron. She took off the lid and showed them the contents. Inside were about 50 badges, all of different colors, all bearing the same letters. S.P.E.W. S.P.E.W, said Harry, picking up a badge and looking at it. What's this about? Not S.P.E.W, said Hermione impatiently. It's S.P.E.W, stands for the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. Never heard of it, said Ron. The making up of Harry and Ron's divination homework, they're turning to creativity rather than assiduous academic study. Perfect for them, of course, but also completely consistent with our perspective on divination as a class, as a magical art, I suppose, more than science, if Professor Trelawney is to be believed, and kind of poking fun at the whole concept of divination, right? The darker, the better. The more dramatic, the better. Playing into that fortune teller tradition, where the fortune teller who tells you that everything's going to be fine and you should probably get your back tire checked, your back passenger side tire, you should probably get that checked because the thread's a little thin, but it'll be fine. I mean, even if you don't, nothing bad's going to happen, but you could probably save yourself $20 or $25 if you get it checked now rather than checking it out in 3 months. That fortune teller goes broke real fast. Divination is all about drama. It is all about theatricality, which is, of course, slightly incompatible with the role of prophecy in the Harry Potter series. More on that later. We're also, of course, introducing a skeptical element here, an element of skepticism vis-a-vis magical artifacts and the telling of truth by magical artifacts, which will be more relevant later. Then we get this line from Ron. "How dare you? We've been working like house elves here." Hermione raised her eyebrows. "It's just an expression," said Ron hastily. Ron trying to cover himself, right? He doesn't want to hurt Hermione's feelings, right? He's not assaulting her here with this very common expression that we've heard, gosh, it must be dozens of times now in the pages of Harry Potter. You know, you can't go a chapter back in Chamber of Secrets without someone saying, "We've been working like house elves all day." Is this an expression that Ron has just made up? Because it was apparently quite a surprise to him that house elves were employed at Hogwarts too. I'm not sure that this is within the common parlance. I'm not sure this is a common idiom for wizards anyway. Certainly we haven't heard it to date. Certainly not a common idiom for Ron specifically. But here we are leaning into the idea of S.P.E.W, S-P-E.W, the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. Yeah, it's okay, completely distinct from the political and philosophical problems that are presented by Hermione's desire to enact social change vis-a-vis the house elves. The joke acronym is just terrible. Like, the joke acronym is just, it's not a good joke. It's certainly not a sufficiently good joke. And Hermione is smarter than this. I can't believe that she couldn't have come up with something better. I'm sure that we here in the Crowdcast chat could brainstorm a much better name for this organization very, very quickly indeed. But of course, this is also the world of owls and newts. So perhaps bad acronyms are as much a ubiquitous element of the wizarding world as wands and banquets in the Great Hall. I'm just not sure. Yes. The Elf Liberation Front, says Megan Moore. Nailing it. There you go. First one, the Elf Liberation Front, which contracts acronymically to ELF. It's perfect. It's perfect. I love it. Even pews would have been better, says Nikki. The Preservation of Elven Welfare Society. Yes. The Promotion of Elven Welfare Society. Yes. I like that very much. Good. Anything, literally anything would be better than the S.P.E.W. You're right. All right. So let's very quickly move on to this last slide. And then we'll just, we'll have this... You guys are chatty tonight. Let's get to the last slide here. S.P.E.W, said Hermione hotly. I was going to put "Stop the outrageous abuse of our fellow magical creatures" and campaign for a change in their legal status. But it wouldn't fit. So that's the heading of our manifesto. She brandished a sheaf of parchment at them. I've been researching it thoroughly in the library. Elf enslavement goes back centuries. I can't believe no one's done anything about it before now. Hermione, open your ears, said Ron loudly. They like it. They like being enslaved. Our short-term aims, said Hermione, speaking even more loudly than Ron and acting as though she hadn't heard a word, are to secure house elves fair wages and working conditions. Our long-term aims include changing the law about non-wand use and trying to get an elf into the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures because they're shockingly underrepresented. And how do we do all this? Harry asked. We start by recruiting members, said Hermione happily. I thought 2 sickles to join. That buys a badge and the proceeds can fund our leaflet campaign. You're treasurer, Ron. I'll get you a collecting tin upstairs. And Harry, you're secretary, so you might want to write down everything I'm saying now as a record of our first meeting. The nice little joke there about 2 sickles to join, about a leaflet campaign. Like, there is some stuff here which is great. There is some stuff here which is very pointed but also rather affectionate satire of adolescent political awareness, right? That first moment when you realize that there is injustice in the world and there exist mechanisms by which we can challenge that injustice, overthrow that injustice. Some of this stuff is actually really good, and it is, appropriate at this age that Hermione Granger, of all people, should be demonstrating an interest in politics. The problems with this storyline do not come from that satirical impulse. The problems with the storyline do not come from, the rather awful and ugly acronym that we're given. The problems here come from a warped and, let's just say, problematic for this week, because I do have a hard out in just a couple minutes. Let's say problematic discourse on slavery as a phenomenon. Specifically, two elements, both of which are represented by this slide. I think I'll delve into this more deeply at the beginning of next week's session. They like it, said Ron. They like being enslaved. This is wildly problematic. This is not just problematic in an in-universe kind of way. This isn't just you've got to squint a little bit to make this work. This is exactly the kind of language, exactly the kind of rhetoric that was used to defend real-world slavery for very long periods of time. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that was used prior to, you know, God, it's so awful, right? It has been used throughout the ages. Throughout the ages, we'll settle for that. I'm not going to, as I say, delve too deeply into the real world history this week. We'll do that next week. That is one element that is extraordinarily problematic here. Ron is given very bad dialogue. Hermione, on the other hand, is taking a moral stand that has nothing to do with the actual welfare of house elves. She is deciding what it is that house elves want and is acting not as an ally, but as a domineering force here. Both of these things in real world politics have terrible, terrible traditions. Both of these things in real world politics are still present today, not just in the discourse surrounding slavery and the discourse of the disenfranchisement of people, the dehumanization of people in this country and in other countries all across the world. This is really difficult language. And for all that J.K. Rowling's perspective on disenfranchisement, on slavery, on representation, for all that her impulses here are good, and for all that her political satirical intent is actually pretty decent and pretty solid here, we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room with regard to this stuff. Okay, yes, C-Star quoting Terry Pratchett's wonderful Discworld novels. Charity ain't giving people what you wants to give. It's about giving them what they need to have. Right. Hermione's first step, if she's really seeking to be an ally, is to talk with house elves and say to those house elves, what is it that you want? What is it that I can do? How can I be an ally? Because the only people who get to decide that are the house elves. That is true of anyone who wants to be an ally to any disempowered, underrepresented, or disenfranchised group in the real world too. You don't get to decide how you can best be, join the fight with people who are of other disenfranchised populations than you are yourself, right? It's a good and positive impulse, but we need to listen to those people to tell us what it is that they need to tell us how we can serve, and I'm saying this, of course, for those of you who are listening to the podcast and not seeing me here on the live video chat. I am, of course, seeing this as a cis-het white man. So this is particularly relevant, and particularly important for me personally. This is something that I myself try to engage with as honestly and as directly and as consistently as I can. Guys, I am afraid that is going to do it. We have 10 questions in the question bucket, and I can't answer any of them because I have a hard out tonight. I'm terribly, terribly sorry. Let me put up my slide for next week, and we'll very quickly gloss what we've got to do. Take these questions over to the forum or take these questions into next week's reading. I've said here that we're going to cover 3 chapters next week. I do really want to cover Goblet of Fire and 4 Champions together. We'll see how we get on. I'm going to relax our schedule a little bit here for Harry Potter, and we will go as far as we can. But at the very least, next week, we can probably run for the full 2 hours. So next week, chapters 15, 16, and 17 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, the Goblet of Fire, and the 4 Champions. That will be at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, February the 13th, 2018. I hope you will be able to join me for that session. Let me cancel that slide and say goodnight to you all. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your brilliant, wise, and insightful commentary. I will come back and read through all of your discussions. Of course, I do urge you to get in touch with me directly at pointnorthmedia@gmail.com, or you can head on over to the brand new forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum, where you can discuss everything relating to Harry Potter, even in a spoiler-free environment. We'll put up some kind of spoiler marker, or I'll try and find a plugin that will allow you to mark spoilers a little more effectively. That would be fine too. I hope to hear from all of you over on the forum via email, and I hope also to see all of you next week. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your company. Until next time, mischief managed. Good night.